Kahoot.it. I'll put that in the chat. Oops, that's with a K. It auto-corrected. There you go. Kahoot.it on your phone. Oh, look at you doing it. You can be anonymous if you want to. You don't have to use your name, or you can. I don't mind either way. This is not for grades or credit. You will then put in that game pin, as most of you are already figuring out, and that will let you put the answers on your phone. So I'll give you a little bit for the rest of you to join in. It's coming along pretty fast. There we go. Okay. Can you hear that music? Can. Good. Okay. If you drop off, the connection data information will be at the bottom of the screen. This little game pin will be down there. And sometimes that happens. And if you just can't get connected for some reason, just keep watching. I'm going to read things and follow along. The point of this is the different approach, just to kind of give it a little more competitive, interesting review kind of a thing. But if you can't connect, it's annoying, but doesn't affect anything. You can still get the benefit. So let's get going. A quick 20 questions. A provisional broker cannot act as a dual agent with their broker in charge. We actually have not covered that yet, but take your best guess. Sometimes not knowing a thing and answering a test question and learning from the question is just as effective as reading a book. So, true blue or false red, provisional broker is not allowed to act as a dual agent with their broker in charge. Exactly what I expected, because even people in the update course get this wrong. Let me take a little quick break here from the Kahoot game and let's talk about that, because we didn't really spend time on this yet. We did talk about a true dual agent compared to a designated dual agent. So true dual agency versus designated dual agency. With true dual agency, the classic example of this is a buyer and a seller represented by one broker in between them, called the dual agent. Side note, for the test, the dual agent is first and foremost the firm. The firm is the dual agent because it's an in-house sale, and there's one broker in that firm handling this thing between the two parties. The broker who's doing the work is also a dual agent, but don't forget about the firm. They might test you on that as well. It's because it's an in-house sale where the buyer is in the firm, meaning being represented by an agent in the firm, and the seller is a listing in that firm, that it's dual agency to begin with. So, in dual agency, what's happening here? No loyalty is allowed. You can't be more loyal to one compared to the other. So if that buyer says, "Hey, I want to offer $680 and they're asking $700, would you think they would come down to $680? Just between you and me, the buyer's telling you. Just I won't tell. Do you think I have a shot? Your answer should be what? If they're asking you for some insight about what the other party is thinking, how should you respond to them? First of all, can you tell them the answer to their question? A good response would be, "I'm sorry, as I explained to you back when we discussed dual agency, I can't give you that information. I may not even know it, but even if I knew it, I couldn't tell you because as a dual agent between you and the seller, I can't give either one of you an advantage over the other one. Pause, rewind. Let me say it again. Testable. As a dual agent between the two parties, the broker can't give an advantage over one compared to the other. And the seller might say, hey, I know that this buyer's lowballing me. I'm offering $800 and they're coming in with $750. Do you think there's any room for them to come up? What's the proper response to that question if you're a dual agent? Same thing. Even though I knew you first, Mr. Seller, and you expect me to give you a little more loyalty than them, I can't. Remember, you told me I could be a dual agent. I cannot tell you that, even if I knew, because I can't give either one of you an advantage over the other one. That's all under true dual agency. So what if this true dual agency thing is happening and you have a partner in the firm? Could both of you be true dual agents between that buyer and the seller? Sure. So it doesn't mean that it has to only be one broker. It can be multiple brokers. Sometimes, by the way, brokers in charge of firms are being a broker in charge as a side gig. They're doing that on the side. They still list and sell their own real estate brokerage properties. They're still helping buyers and sellers and doing that side of the business while being a BIC. That's not uncommon. So it could very well be that this listing is your own BIC's listing. Your BIC is the listing agent for that seller. You, the provisional broker, are the one helping the buyer. Well, let me say it this way. You met the buyer. Your BIC has the listing. If both you and your BIC are acting as true dual agents, you're still holding hands, working together. And so that is allowed. It's allowed for you and your BIC to be a true dual agent as partners, both of you being true dual agents. Neither one of you allowed to tell either side something secret about the opposite side. Neither one of you are allowed to be more loyal to one side over the other. You're being true dual agents together, working together, limited by the same rules together. So you as a provisional broker are allowed to be a dual agent along with your BIC. Does that make sense? Why are you belaboring this point, Neil? Because if we're over here at designated dual agency, it's not the same way. With designated dual agency, we have a buyer and a seller, and we have a broker. Let's say you, the provisional broker, is helping the buyer. And let's say a non-provisional broker is helping the seller. Is this allowed so far? Is it okay for you, the provisional, to be designated to help the buyer and another broker in the firm to be designated to help the seller? Yeah. Is loyalty restored? You're loyal to your buyer. The other broker's loyal to that seller? Yep. Still good. Designated dual agency is working just fine. Finely tuned machine so far. What if instead of just any old broker helping the seller, it's your BIC representing the seller? Do we have a problem? Because you have been assigned and designated to help that buyer. Your BIC is the listing agent of the house your buyer wants to buy. You also need to always have a very close relationship with your BIC, overseeing all of your transactions. How can this be healthy while this is healthy too? In other words, how can your BIC possibly give you insight and help you through a transaction where your respective clients are working against each other? And that's inherently what a transaction is. The buyer's trying to get the opposite goal of the seller. The buyer wants the lowest price, the seller wants the highest price, among other things, for the most part. Sure, there's compromise, but the point is this. The testable piece here is this. Listen carefully. With designated dual agency, it is not allowed for a provisional broker to be designated for one party while their own BIC is designated to the other party. All other combinations are allowed, meaning it can be a PB up against another PB. It can be a PB up against a full broker. It can be a full broker against a full broker. It can be any of these things. It can even be a full broker against their own BIC. But it can't be a PB against their own BIC. With that said, let's look at this question again. A provisional broker cannot act as a dual agent with their broker in charge. That is false. Because a provisional broker actually can act as a dual agent with their broker in charge. When they're a dual agent, they're not against their BIC. They're working alongside their BIC, both as true dual agents together. This next little bit, I'll tell you, might help this sink in. When someone agrees to be a dual agent and do dual agency between a buyer and a seller, all of the brokers in the firm are dual agents as well. True dual agency. And when we have designated dual agency, meaning one broker helping the buyer, a separate broker in the firm helping the seller, those two specific agents are designated dual agents for their respective parties, but all the other brokers, not them, are true dual agents. The only designated dual agents are the ones directly working with the seller and with the buyer. Two different agents in the same firm. Does that make sense? So let's keep going. I think we're going to see another question that will kind of seal this down a little bit. Hey, where'd my sound go? Oh, there it is. Caveat emptor means what? Red, let the seller beware. Yellow, let the buyer beware. There we go. Blue, let the agent beware. Or green, let the firm beware. Which one is caveat emptor? Let who beware? Good job. Let the buyer beware. Caveat emptor, let the buyer beware. Let the buyer beware of the seller, because the seller could choose not to tell you anything about the house. Not let the buyer beware of the broker, because we have to disclose as brokers, we have to disclose material facts. And it's not let the seller beware, not let the firm beware, it's the buyer. Oh, a little shakeup. Getting exciting. All the following are allowed to do designated agency except which pair of people? Who are not allowed to do designated dual agency against each other? A PB versus a PB. A BIC versus a non-provisional. A broker versus a provisional broker. Or a BIC versus a provisional broker. Good job. By far, a PB, a provisional broker, is not allowed to go up against their own BIC in designated dual agency. Because when it's designated dual agency, that is exactly what's happening. They are against each other. When it's this one, they're against each other. When it's true dual agency, they're working with each other. They're not against each other when it's true dual agency. It's only when it's designated that they are pitted against each other, each one representing the opposite parties. A broker cannot be a designated agent if what? If they don't like the buyer or the seller, they can't be a designated agent. If they know confidential info about the other client. If they are still a provisional broker, or if they have not paid their renewal fee. In which case can a broker not be eligible to become a designated buyer agent, for instance? There it is. Good job. That was the other piece of this designated dual agency thing. Let's say that this is what happens. You go into the conference room or the workroom in your office and you're so excited. Let's not blame you. Let's blame your friend, fellow agent down the hall. She comes in and she's so excited because she just got a new listing for $800,000. And she says, "Hey, everybody, it's all 5 of you in there. I'm super excited. I got this listing I've been working so hard, trying so hard to get. And yeah, we're a little bit overpriced. It's listed at 800,000, but they told me if we could try 800 for a couple of weeks, they would drop it to 750 and they'd really actually be happy with 750. Do we have a problem? Did she violate anything? She has disclosed some confidential information. What she has not only done, she has not only harmed her seller client, her brand new seller client, but she has also disqualified all 5 of you in the workroom who heard this information, because none of you are now allowed to ever be a designated buyer agent up against her because you know something confidential. You would have to disqualify yourself. Don't ask me how is that going to be enforced. You won't be tested on that part. It might be the honor system, who knows? But if it all goes sideways and people find out, people talk and stuff, but that's not the point. The point is, if you know something confidential about the seller, you can't be a designated dual agent helping the buyer up against them, and vice versa. Most of you got that. So I probably didn't even need to explain all that, but that's the reason why. Good job. Undisclosed dual agency is legal in certain situations, true or false? Can you not tell people that you're being a dual agent? Can act like it, but not tell people that you're doing it. Is that okay? Undisclosed dual agency is not legal ever. You have to behave properly and tell people if you're being a dual agent or not. Don't act like it and then they never told you were allowed to, but you're actually behaving as a dual agent without permission. That's not allowed. Express agency is always in writing. True or false? Express agency. What does express agency mean? Not whether it's in writing or not, but whether you've talked about it or not. The talking could be in writing or it could be verbal. It's express agency if it's oral buyer agency because you had the conversation with them. It's not in writing because it's oral buyer agency, but you told them how it works, right? Yeah, express agency is the intentional one. You got it. And don't be disappointed or mad at yourself if you get it wrong, because getting it wrong, I think, is more beneficial because it makes it stick in your head more, because that negative feeling of, oh man, I knew that. That's probably going to go a longer way toward keeping it stuck in your memory better than if you just glossed over it and got it real easy. So it's a learning tool. Agency is the fiduciary relationship between what parties? Between who? The principal and the agent, the principal and the broker whose face is on the sign in the yard, the firm and the provisional broker, or the seller and the buyer? This is just knowing the terminology. Good job. The principal and the agent. The principal is the client. The agent is who? Who's the agent? Who or what is the agent? For the purposes of this test, the firm. You got it. So it's between the firm and the client. because the principal is the client. In dual agency, the broker can neither help nor hinder either party. True or false? That is true. Can't give an advantage to either side. Can't be more loyal to one than the other. Can't help or hinder. It's another classic way of saying it. Help or hinder either party over the other party. Designated agency is a form of dual agency. True or false? Okay, sorry. Good job. Yeah, it's officially called designated dual agency. So both of them are dual agency. One of them involves at least two brokers. The other one could be at least one broker. But both of them could be many, many brokers. But with designated dual agency, you know it's at least one per each side. Buyers and sellers agency has been around since the dawn of time. True or false? Got some fast answers coming in now. Correct. Seller's agency has been around forever, but buyer agency is only since about 1995. What's first substantial contact? What's this thing called first substantial contact? Is it money and motivation? Is it when their finger glows up? Is it when they tell you their name, or when you give them your business card? Yeah, the two M words, money and motivation. They've either told you about what they can afford or how much money they've got or what they can spend no more than, or they've told you how bad they have a time frame that they need to stick to. Watch out for decoy answers like, I would kind of like to move in the spring. Is that motivation? That's not desperate enough. I've got to be out by fall. I have to. That's motivation, right? Wow, sticking firm there. Good job. What does a signed working with agents disclosure accomplish? We kind of haven't gotten there because that's more chapter 8. What is that working with agents disclosure talking about? Does it establish buyer and seller agency? Does it set up the agency relationship? Does it prove that you explained how everything works? Does it allow you to write an offer for them? Or does it prove that you're a real estate broker? All it does, as we'll see when we actually study it more closely, is it gives you proof that you told them what you're supposed to tell them. It is not the hiring document. It's not the actual buyer agency agreement. That's a separate document. This is the required first point of contact. Hey, guys, before you tell me what you can afford, what you can spend, or what your motivation is, let me pause and give you some fair warnings. Don't tell me anything you don't want the seller to know because I am the listing agent. Or don't tell me anything you don't want the buyer to know because I'm working for the buyer. So I need you to sign this document right here that just gives me proof for me to keep in my file folder that I explained this to you as I'm required to by law. By the way, the Real Estate Commission could do a spot audit and just show up at your firm and look through some files and see if they have the proper documents in them. And so that's going to be you can just blame them. Say, look, guys, I am governed by the real estate commission. That's where I got my license, and that's who could take it away if I don't do this right. So please help me stay in the business. This does not hire me. We don't even have to do that today. I'm not asking you to hire me today, but since we talked and we might be talking about money or motivation, please sign here showing that I've explained to you what your options are about representation. There's that pen, whoever needs the pen there at the bottom. That'll make more sense when we actually study it. So I'm not surprised that there was a bit of a mix up there. When does the buyer agency agreement have to be put in writing? At the time of offer, when you show the first home, when you meet at Starbucks to talk about stuff, or when you have them sign that working with agents disclosure? When does the buyer agency agreement have to be put in writing? You got it. Good job. At time of offer. You could do an oral buyer agency relationship forever and ever and ever and ever, as long as you're never writing any offers. Not going to be a great way to pay your bills. And there are plenty of people that would be glad for you to show them pretty houses all the time when they have spare time. So you got to shut that down and make sure that they work in a way that helps you provide for the family or for yourself. But the minute they want to start making an offer on something, you got to convert this oral buyer agency into written buyer agency. Do potential clients have to sign the Working with Agents brochure? Are they required to sign it? Can you make them sign it? You can't make anybody sign anything. Good job. And what if they don't sign it? If they refuse to sign it, what is your option then? Hey, guys, before you tell me how much you can afford, how much you've been pre-qualified for, and before you tell me how bad you need to be in by any certain date maybe, or how motivated you are to actually buy this house, I need you to sign this document explaining that I explained to you that right now I don't work for you. I would like to. I think we'll work well together. But until I do, don't expect any protections of your confidential info because I don't have the legal capacity to offer that to you yet until you hire me. And so that's what this document is all about, which we'll look at more closely in 8. I'll show you it. It's a 1-page document, and it just says who you're representing, one of them or both of them or the other one, but not this one. So if they refuse, some people say, you know what, I don't sign anything. I just met you at this open house and I want to see the house down the street. And now you're asking me to sign papers, and can't you just let me into the neighbor's house? And you have this conversation. You say, well, yes, I can, but I need you to know not to tell me stuff. Well, I already know that. I'm not signing your dumb paper. Okay. You don't have to beat me up over it. All you need is this document in your files. It would be best if you had their signature, but if they get all in a way in their feelings about it, you just need to write on that Working with Agents disclosure, this idiot won't sign it. They're being a jerk. No, don't write that. Just say they wouldn't sign it and date it just so that you have it in your file and can show it to the real estate commission that they wouldn't sign it. So therefore you did have the conversation though. And that's okay. That's okay. Try hard to get them to sign it, but if they won't, you still need it in the file. And you just acknowledge that you tried, but they wouldn't do it. What type of agency is either written or verbal? Express, implied, broker agency, or specific agency? Could be written, could be verbal. Which one is it? There we go. Express agency. I think we got that one locked in for most of you. Express could be either one. It's the intentional one. You intentionally discussed it, whether in writing or talking about it. That is the right answer there. Who are the parties to an offer to purchase? This one kind of got thrown in there. Who are the parties to an offer to purchase? The listing agent and the seller and the buyer, seller and the listing firm, or the buyer and the buyer's agent? Parties to an offer to purchase. Good job. Yeah. The buyer and the seller are the parties to an offer to purchase. An offer to purchase is something we're going to study in 9 and 10. So totally get it if this didn't make sense because we haven't talked about it yet. I don't know why this one is in here. I need to change it. An offer to purchase is the thing that you write that hopefully becomes a contract. So it's going to be between the buyer and the seller, not between the buyer and the buyer agent. Between the buyer and the buyer agent would be a buyer agency agreement. Oh, look at that. That's weird. Huh. 1 second. Camera randomly went off. There I am. Not that you need to see me, but thanks, tell me. Must an oral buyer agency agreement be reduced to writing before making an offer? Yes or no? Yes, it must. Got to be put into writing before you can write that offer. What terms of loyalty does the buyer owe the agent in an oral buyer agency agreement? What terms of loyalty are owed in oral buyer agency? Whatever the commission is mentioned on the listing, eternal love and commitment, none, no loyalty, for a certain time period of commitment. The buyer owing the agent. Does the buyer owe the agent anything when it's oral buyer agency? They owe them nothing. They could go look at 5 houses with you, and then an hour later look at the same 5 houses with me and write an offer on one of them. And the fact that you spent 2 hours with them earlier, irrelevant if all you had with them was an oral buyer agency agreement, because they owe you nothing. Designated dual agency is when a buyer and seller are represented by the same broker human. True or false? I'll check that out, Joe. Designated dual is when the buyer and seller are represented by the same. Correct. That is false. That is not true, because designated means one for each of them, minimum. Good job. A provisional broker can act as a designated dual agent up against their own broker in charge. True or false? That is false. Well done. Let's see who won. The winner gets $500 from the neighbor. Kind of go outside, go to your neighbor's house, knock on the door, tell them I told them to give you $500 and let us know how well that works for you. Good job, Joe. And Gio. And Victor. Okay, let's see. Number 18. Let me check 18 one more time. Good. I'm glad that's helpful. At least it helps you hear something besides my voice, which is a nice thing to change up a little bit. Oh yeah, I gotta turn that sound off. Here we go. Okay, back in action. So again, dual agency is only possible with in-house sales. It might look something like this. Same firm represents the buyer who's buying the seller's property, and the seller property is a listing of that firm as well. And so in this case, both Byron and Layla are dual agents. They are not designated to each respective side. They're acting together. We could probably even take down that fence as far as the two agents are involved. It's still in place because of the buyer and seller, but they're both being true dual agents. Both of them can't be loyal to either side more than the other. They are both limited as to what they can share with each respective party. They are not like Layla just for her and Byron just for him. This is Byron and Layla being dual agents, just as if Byron was a dual agent by himself or Layla by herself. That's the thing that can be confusing. No loyalty to either side more than the other. No advantage to one over the other, even if you like one of them more. And it could be a couple of people, a whole team of people, or just one person being a dual agent. Why? Why dual agency? If loyalty is off the table, that's not great. What's the trade-off for no loyalty? Why would people even consider that terrible arrangement? Why are they even interested in maybe allowing you to be a dual agent between them and not helping them get the best deal by telling them some confidential insight about the other party because you're not allowed to? Why are they motivated to let you be a dual agent? It's the money, baby. With dual agency, who's involved? Looks like this. There we go. True dual agency. We got the buyer, we got the seller. And the buyer has called you on your yard sign. You're the listing agent, and so you are the dual agent in between them. Working for both of them. Are you a buyer agent when you're a dual agent? Yes. Are you a listing agent when you're a dual agent? Yes, you're both. And so while you can't be loyal to either side over the other, the reason you might agree to dual agency and all the headaches it might present for you, and the reason they might give up loyalty, is because maybe back when you listed it, you told them, I'll list it for 6%. And I'll keep 3 for me and my firm, and I'll give up 3 to the other side who brings the buyer. Well, that's not what's happening here. What's happening is you are the only broker, so you might be getting that entire 6 yourself. In real life, odds are the seller or the buyer or both are going to say, hey, wait a minute, you're getting that entire 6? Well, would you settle for 5 or 4? And then maybe the seller could come down in their price a little. The buyer could go up a little in the price and you could meet somewhere in the middle because you're not holding out for your entire 6. They're able to save a little money, and either 5 or 4 is still more than the 3 you would have gotten if it had been sold by another agent. See there? So that's probably the real world reason that people even do this nonsense to begin with. I've done it several times. I'll do it again in the right circumstance, but I won't do it in certain circumstances. I would have to feel like the parties could handle it and that I felt comfortable doing it, because it is definitely potentially tricky. If the parties are already suspicious, if you don't have a really firm foundation of trust established, at least one of them, you probably shouldn't touch it, because the danger is that the seller or the buyer or both at some point in that long transaction, because 30, 40, 60 days is long when things aren't going well. If they ever get the feeling that you're giving the other side more of an advantage than you are to them, you're messed up. You've got a terrible situation and probably bad reviews at the end of the whole thing. And I might try to turn you in because of, even if it's not even a legit reason to turn you in, you got to deal with the whole issue. So it is not for the faint of heart. Certainly, I don't think it's for a provisional broker. I think a provisional they should be guided by their BIC anyway, but proceed super cautiously. Yeah, good question in the chat. Doing more work for less compensation. So that gets right down to it. But the question is, how much less compensation? Is 6 your number? And if so, fine. I'll do dual agency, but only if I get both sides. But you would have gotten 3 if it were another agent bringing the buyer. So even 5 or 4 is still more than you would have gotten. So then the question is, let's make real numbers. These just look like ones between, but on $700,000, if you make 3%, that's 21 grand. If you make 4%, that's 28 grand. Is 7 grand enough of a difference for you to put up with dual agency? That's a business decision. That's a nice chunk of money. And it might be worth it to me. But if I feel like these are 2 personality types, buyer and sellers, that are just going to inevitably be at odds and doubt me and be suspicious, then 7 is not nearly enough. 100 might not be enough. And I might just say, you know what? It's not always about money. It's about peace of mind. And I don't want to just always be worried and stressed that I'm handling this dual agency thing perfectly and people aren't going to get mad about something. So that's why some people just don't even do it. But it's allowable. And we talked about that, and we talked about this. Okay, undisclosed dual agency. One firm represents both parties because it's dual, but they don't have permission to do so. When you list a property on the listing agreement, let me do that. Let me flip over. It's right here. Oh, good. The place for dual agency is toward the back. Right there. Seller authorizes firm to act as a dual agent, representing both the seller and the buyer, subject to certain conditions. Seller does or does not authorize the same agent to represent both seller and buyer. Check the box. And then more specifically, if we need to address an established designated dual, there's a place for initials for that. So you need that permission. And you need to get it from the seller in the beginning. You could explain this to your seller when you list the property, and they could say, well, that doesn't sound great. I don't want to do it. And you could say, fine. And you just don't plan to do it. But then 3 weeks later, you get a showing or a buyer call, and you haven't had very many showings, and the buyer seems pretty interested, and you're like, hey, seller, this buyer doesn't have an agent. Are you sure you don't want me to be allowed to do dual? I don't care, but we might get this thing done faster if I can be a dual agent here. They might say, well, I don't want you to be one. I still don't like it. And you could say, okay, There is still a chance, though, that you could be the only agent involved in the transaction, which we talked about a while ago, in which case you would be telling the buyer, look, buyer, I will not be a dual agent, but if you want to make an offer on my listing, I can guide you through that offer. I just can't keep any secrets, so don't tell me anything you don't want the seller to know. You would remain an unrepresented buyer. I'm going to be a listing agent as I already am, but I can help you with the paperwork, provide the forms. I can't give you advice though, and because that would be being a bit of a dual agent. And I certainly can't tell you anything that affects the seller's negotiating position. And that buyer might not care. Maybe they've had enough experience buying in their lives that they don't even think they need an agent. Obviously, they'd need to feel that way a little bit to go along with this. There are some agents who don't do dual agency, but they would do this arrangement. They would work with an unrepresented buyer. But this is where you spell all that out. And so then you go back to that seller and say, hey, are you sure? And they might say, okay, whatever. Yeah, you can be a dual agent. You just have to, again, get permission from everybody before you do it. Let me show you the working with agents disclosure. Oh, no, let me show you a break. I'll see you back here in 10 minutes. So undisclosed dual agency, if you're doing dual agency, you have to get permission. They have to know it. You can't act like it. Otherwise, you're breaking the law. And in this case, Byron is the only agent involved. He's helping the buyer. Sarah is a seller unrepresented. He's got to help her with certain aspects of the transaction, though. She doesn't know where to get paperwork. Why would she? Anybody not in the business wouldn't necessarily know where to get the disclosure, the residential property disclosure. So he would be the source for a lot of these things. He would put the offer together with his buyer, and then he would meet with Sarah and present it to her and explain it to her. And she might say, well, what are houses worth out here in this area? He would not give her a market analysis with his opinions, but he could give her some comparable sales from the MLS that are not translated, not his opinion about them. Just, hey, here's 3 that have sold in the last couple of months. So he would need to help her to some degree. What he should not do is lead her to believe that he's going to protect her confidential information. If she were to say, well, okay, they're offering $690 and I'm asking for $7. If I were to counter with $697, do you think I could get them up anymore? If he were to answer that and act like he could answer that, he would be committing undisclosed dual agency. He'd be acting like he should be helping her, and he shouldn't. His proper answer to that question is, I can't give you advice. All I can do is give you the offer. You tell me how you want to respond. Because I am not a dual agent here, and he couldn't give him that advice if he were a dual agent, by the way. I am the buyer's agent. You should look at me and think of me as the buyer. Just tell me what you want the buyer to know, and I'll relay it back over to them. He's got to be very careful. The first way he's going to explain that to her is verbally when he tells her how this whole thing works. The second way that he's going to want to reiterate that fact is with something in writing, a document called the unrepresented seller disclosure. And that's going to explain to her, look, I am not your person. Let's see here. I've got one close. There we go. And it would look like this. He would go to her house and say, hey, I'm a buyer agent. We talked on the phone. You said you would consider paying a buyer agency fee to me, which would not be a full listing commission. It'd be a part of it, a partial one. Because all I'm doing here is helping the buyer. I'm not helping you. You don't want to list your house. You're your own agent. Congratulations. I like to make the joke. Congratulations. You're in the business. We're colleagues now. In fact, you have more listings than most of the people in the business because you've got your one listing because it's your house, right? By the way, let me explain how this whole relationship thing works. He would then pull out the seller's version of this working with agents disclosure. Let's go ahead and look at it. It's a 1-page document. We revised how this works. Originally, when all this came about back in 1995, 96, this was a brochure that we would use and get the signatures on. And it was pretty good. But over time, the Real Estate Commission did an assessment and realized we need to get better. We need to explain this better. We need to give a better document that's more clear. And so they came up with all the same information, but just presented in a different format. The brochure that I just showed you, the black and purple, still exists. But now it's not the actual disclosure that gets signed anymore. It's a questions and answers about the situation that helps you explain it to them with some visuals. This single page for sellers and then another single page for buyers is the first thing we're going to go over with a potential client. And in this case, we're talking to a for sale by owner. So let's look at our options here. I'm doing a little crossover here because, well, it's late and I want to keep you guys awake. So first box, this is not a contract. we are very careful to let them know this does not hire me. So don't worry about it, potential client, or in this case, for sale by owner. This is just acknowledging that I gave it to you. By signing this, it gives me proof, and I'll give you a copy of this. And so I can have proof that I went over this important topic with you, because you need to understand whether you're represented or not and who represents you. As agents, we're required to go over this form with you at something called first substantial contact. It's right there, guys. This is the consumer form that we're presenting. And so it tells them exactly what we already know. Before getting or asking for your confidential info, you need to know who represents who. So you might not want to give your confidential info. And then I'll give you a copy of it once you've signed it. And it's for your own protection. Don't share any confidential information with anybody or assume the agent is working in your behalf until you have gotten a different document signed with them that officially hires them, a written agency agreement. This is not that. This is just a warning, an FYI disclosure warning kind of a thing. And here are the choices. In the middle, there are 4 options. If you're going on a listing appointment and trying to get that seller to list their house with you, then you're ultimately going to want to be this person to them. The agent who gave you this form must enter into a written listing agreement with you before they begin to market your property. In other words, the seller might say, I don't want to do this paperwork tonight. Can you go ahead and put the sign in the yard and come back over the weekend and we'll sign the papers? And you can say, no, I can't. Not allowed to. Look right here. The commission says so. I can't do any marketing until we get this listing in writing. If you sign that listing agreement, then me and my firm and the other agents in my firm represent you. And the buyer would be represented by somebody else, a different firm. If all we're doing is seller agency, that's what's happening. This is not about dual agency. That's going to be talked about next, in the next block. But this top block is just, you're listing with me, I'm your person, I'm going to help you sell it. The buyer's going to come from another place, another firm. Then if you do offer dual agency, you'll get into the middle boxes. And you'll say, but if you want to let me try to find a buyer myself and represent both of you at the same time and do this thing called dual agency. This form, by the way, guys, is not for them to initial. If you look at the bottom, no, it doesn't say it at the bottom. Oh, it's this one. Note to agent, check all relationships below that apply to this seller. This form is for you to pick which of these 4 things you're willing to offer them. Which of these 4 relationships you're going to authorize and offer. It is not for them to give you permission to do any of this. That's a different form. That's the actual agency forms. This is for you to say, hey, I'm disclosing that this is what I do. And you might be disclosing that all you do is seller agency. Because all you're there to do is list it. You don't ever want to be a dual agent. So you're not going to check those. You could say, well, I'll explain to you what dual agency is, but I don't want to do it because I don't like it. Because I don't get to be most loyal to you, and I don't want to compromise my loyalty. Is that okay with you? You might say it a little warmer than that, but that's a good way of saying, I'm here for you and only you. I don't even want to go there. By the way, if I did offer dual agency, I would make more money, but I so don't want to go there and compromise the loyalty that I'm willing to not have a shot at making double what I could make. That might make an impression. Oh, she's willing to give up some money so that she can be my one and only agent. That's pretty good. But if it is something, then here's where we talk about it. If you do offer it, if your firm lets you offer it, then you'll cover it. You'll talk about what it is. It occurs if there's a buyer represented by my firm and they want to buy your listing represented by my firm. And if you agree, and only if you agree in writing, then we could do that and represent you both at the same time, called dual agency. But that's a good place for you to explain to them, but only with your permission. I'm not going to sneak up on you and do it dual agency to you It's got to be with your full awareness and permission. Dual agents' loyalty would be divided. Oh, that's an important one. It's spelled out right there. The guys, you could read through this form, get familiar enough with it as if you were going to present it as an agent, which you will eventually have to do anyway. And by doing that and reading through this form a couple of times, you're going to learn what you need to know about this for the test, because it's all spelled out right there. Exactly what I just covered in the last 2 hours. So it talks about the loyalty divided. But the firm and its agents must still treat you and the buyer fairly and equally, another important point, and can't help you gain an advantage over the other party. I mean, it doesn't get much better than that. It really just makes it crystal clear. If, by the way, when I'm talking to these update class students, I say, well, I know you, so you've told me that you don't want to do dual agency. Do you do designated dual? Some of them and their firms will let them do one of those things, but not the other one, for whatever reason. And that's why it's spelled out separately here. You could say, hey, we could also do a thing where if I find a buyer for your house and that buyer doesn't have an agent already, and you don't want me to be a dual agent and represent them too, I could connect them with another broker in our firm. We still keep it in-house, but they are working for them and I'm working for you. And what I like to tag on to that explanation when I'm talking about designated dual, I like to say it's as if we were two separate firms again. It's almost like we're not in-house at all, because they've got their own agent and you've got me. But again, you must agree to it. It'd be something that you would agree to before we could do it. And then finally, out of these 4 possible ways you could work for them, the last one, if you're on a listing appointment, you're probably not going to talk to them about this last option, because they've hired you or they've called you out there on the appointment to talk about listing their property. And this last option is if a buyer agent is working with a seller that's not represented by an agent at all, or a for sale by owner. So this would be what you're going to talk about if you're a buyer agent and your buyer wants to consider buying a house that is not listed, but is on the market by the owner themselves. So you're going to go out to that FSBO and you're going to say, hey, first of all, let me show you and explain this. I don't represent you. I have no loyalty to you. Think of me as the buyer in terms of you would never tell the buyer the lowest you might take, so don't tell me, because I would have to tell the buyer that. You've got to give them that warning. And the agent will represent just the buyer, so don't share confidential. I think they've been pretty redundant about sharing confidential info, haven't they? If you don't get it by reading this form as a consumer, you weren't paying attention, right? So note to seller, for more info about the agent's duties, look at the brochure, the black and purple, called Questions and Answers. And at that point, you would make this available to them if you need to. You are no longer required to give this to them, but it's useful if they're not quite getting it and they need more help understanding the concept, which is perfectly understandable because it is a bit of a weird thing in real estate, this agency concept. And you get them to sign it. And this is the thing that if they won't sign it, you would sign it and say they wouldn't sign it, so I'm acknowledging that I tried, basically. And that's the one for sellers. And if we look at it sort of as a overall view, we had the box explaining stuff up front at the top. We had the 4 options that you choose to offer them. It could just be one of the 4. It could be all of the 4 or 2 or 3. And then the signature at the bottom. And if we compare that to the one for buyers, pretty darn exactly the same, except for 2 spots. The top box still explains, hey, don't tell me anything you don't want the other side to know. I can't keep your secrets yet. You haven't hired me yet. This does not hire me. This just explains to you how it all works. The other differences between the 2 is if you're going to represent them as a buyer agent would be the first box. The dual and designated are exactly the same. And then if you are a listing agent and they are choosing to be an unrepresented buyer making an offer on your listing, and you're going to help them out, guide them through it, but not as a dual agent, but as a listing agent helping an unrepresented buyer, in which case they need to remember And you need to make sure you tell them, don't tell me any secrets. You are your own buyer agent. It's not me. And this is the thing that saves you from being an undisclosed dual agent, right? So having this signed is going to help, but then also not saying things along the way that make them think that you are keeping their secrets would be the other part of that. So you've talked to that for sale by owner seller with this one. You've gotten them to hopefully sign the bottom after you check this last line here. I'm in this as a buyer agent. You are your own agent. And the other thing is you're going to bring this thing out, the unrepresented seller disclosure. It's only a couple of pages, and it just says, hey, seller, this is between you and my firm, and you're the owner of the property at this location, and you do not have your own agent, but I have a buyer who's interested. And if you sell to my buyer, you will pay me and my firm, fill in the blank. 3% buyer agency commission, 4%, 2%, whatever, purely negotiable. By the way, in all agency agreements, and we could dig through the listing one and find this same paragraph, it just stands out more because this is only a couple pages. But this has to be in every agency agreement. All bold, all caps, making sure they understand, look, we don't care what anybody looks like, what they believe in, where they came from. We're going to treat you all the same. Real estate should be equally available to everybody without regard to race, color, religion, sex, national origin, handicap, or familial status, the protected classes. In fact, because this form and all these forms were written by the Realtor Association, North Carolina Association of Realtors, in conjunction with the North Carolina Attorneys, the Bar Association, the Realtor membership has chosen to be more specific and add in the fact that, look, we also are not going to discriminate based on sexual orientation or gender identity. So it's the 7 federal protected classes plus the 2 more, which actually have been addressed by the federal. And they basically say, well, the sex category, which originally was put in there to mean don't discriminate on male versus female, now that encompasses any sort of sexual identification, orientation categories as well. But we're being redundant here. So we got to make sure all these agency documents have to have this. And that's another testable item. They must have the fair housing language. And then this part, the fee is going to be considered earned if the seller enters into a contract at any time within blank days. Once earned, it's due and payable at the earlier of which, either closing or the seller's failure to sell because of their own fault. If they default, just change their mind, this says they still owe you that buyer agency fee. If they decide to list their property before this agreement expires, then this agreement doesn't exist anymore legally. Then you're going to probably still get paid as a buyer agent, but you're going to get paid through their listing agent that they've hired. You don't get to tack on this additional 2 or 3% to whatever that is too. So it's acknowledging that. And then it's saying, hey, seller, my firm and me represent the client, the buyer client, and we are acting on their behalf, not on your behalf. Pretty redundant, very specific and explicit. Any information that I learn from you must be disclosed to my client. Don't tell me anything you don't want them to know. If you tell me something that you're compelled to sell by a certain date, that's a motivation thing. That you're prepared to lower the price, that you're asking $750, but another week from now you might drop, then I've got to tell them. Because again, it's like their ears are my ears. So keep it in mind. Seller is advised to keep this in mind when communicating. They always say the firm, but it's the firm via you. By way of you're representing your firm. And by signing this, the seller is saying that this has been previously orally disclosed when the firm first discussed an appointment to show the property. So the chain of events when you're working with a for sale by owner is you call them because your buyer is interested. And you say, hey, curious, I'm representing a buyer who's interested. Would you pay me a buyer agency fee? And they might say, yeah, sure. Okay, great. When can I see your house? Okay, you're bringing them? Well, no, but I need to see your house first. This is how this works, and make sure it's going to work for them. Because you want to have this stuff nailed down before your buyer and that seller get introduced to each other. Because if you don't, there was a chance that they could maybe go around you and try to do you out. And while you might have a buyer agency agreement with your buyer, which is somewhat enforceable, good luck. It's better just to not put yourself in that position to begin with, and let's make sure that everybody's behaving themselves, including your own buyer. And then they have a little reminder here even. These boxes are useful, and they're all over all of these documents. Little reminders of things that you might also need to go include as well. Hey, don't sign this form, seller, until the agent has shown you the working with agents disclosure or brochure. So when you're brand new, when you're out there as a provisional broker, read through all the forms. That's part of what you're going to do in post-licensing. But just maybe you can ease your nerves of all the myriad of things there is to learn and cover that we aren't even going to get to in the class. You don't have to learn some stuff the stuff you need out there in the wild is not the stuff you need to pass the class, right? But it's okay because there's a lot of guidance, a lot of these boxes. There's also in the forms, there's guideline documents. So there's like guidelines to preparing the buyer agency agreement, guidelines to the listing agreement, guidelines to the contract, offer to purchase. So that's what that looks like. I think it's useful to see what it is out there in the wild that you'll run into. Good question. Let's see here. Even if the firm you work for allows dual agency, can you still say you are not interested? Or is it one of those things your BIC tells you have to do? Good question. You could choose not to do it because we are independent contractors. We are not employees. And it could be that your BIC says, if you want to do it, I don't have a problem with you doing it. But you personally might have tried it once and it went terribly and you're like, forget it. I'm done not doing it. So that's enough. The fact that you don't want to do it is enough. It's sort of like the commission. There might be a bare minimum that the firm would allow you to cut to. They might say, we'd rather you charge 6, but if you need to like beat someone else out, we will let you go down to 5. But you could choose to make a personal business decision to be like, I'm always charging 6. I'm never going to cut. I don't like to say always and never because in real life that will cause you to go back on it every time. But yeah, point is, yes, you could make those choices. Good question to ask your BIC when you're interviewed, just to be sure. But and I would say that if they don't want you to do it and they insist that you're following their every guideline, that might be a reason you don't join them. You might want to be with a firm that's a little more loose. Because the first firm I joined had a great reputation. They're #1 independent firm in the whole city of Charlotte. And I didn't mind this requirement because I would have done it anyway, but the shirt and tie requirement. Because I was 23 and I was worried about somebody accusing me of not having enough experience. And I had a beard, that helped, but I also dressed up. I wanted to be better dressed than most of the people because it might help me elevate and look like I knew what I was doing, even if I didn't. But they required it. And if I didn't like it, then don't join that firm, right? So in a designated dual agent situation, the BIC officially would designate that agent to represent the the parties. The firm and other licensees are dual agents representing both clients. The only designated agents are the ones designated specifically for the buyer and the seller. So we've talked about this already. Designated is a form of dual. The BIC should have a policy in place saying whether or not they allow it. and the clients have to give permission. It's up to them to give permission or not. If they don't, you can't do it. Designated agents are exclusive to the specific parties to the transaction, the buyer and the seller. There's that camera again. I'm just going to get rid of it. Designated dual, not allowed between PB and BIC. We talked about that already. It's allowed between everybody else, but not the broker in charge up against their own provisional broker. Provisional versus provisional is allowed. That's one that some people are confused by. Can a provisional broker in the firm be representing the buyer as a designated dual agent, while another provisional broker represents the seller? Some people get confused and think, well, how can the BIC help them both if it's a BIC for both of those PBs? But just because they're a broker in charge helping them doesn't mean they're giving away secrets from each side. They can guide them and help them understand the process, but they're not going to say, "Oh, I happen to know that they're willing to come down another 10,000, so try that." They're not going to do that. But they would say, "Okay, the next thing you need to do is, all right, get from your client such and such and explain to your client what their choices are." A sole practitioner is me. I don't have anybody affiliated with me. I'm all by myself by choice because I don't want to manage right now. I just want to do listing and selling. I might add an assistant at some point, but right now that I could make money if I had like 20 brokers doing their own thing and I'd make a little piece of each of theirs. The last firm I was with, I told you it was an 85-15 split. I could get 15 or 20% of what a crowd of other brokers sold. But the thing is, what if they had an altercation or a problem? I would have to stop what I'm doing and help them fix that issue, which might mean talking to some other agent, some other broker in charge at some other firm, and fuss at people on the phone and them fuss at me. And a lot of BICs I know aren't BICs forever because it's sort of a stressful position and you have to deal and clean up a lot of messes. And sometimes agents get really crazy and just don't follow the right rules. And a good friend of mine is a BIC of a firm in South Charlotte, and he had actually Fort Mill, nonstop stories of what his own agents were doing out there in the wild that caused him to have to get on the phone and clean up messes. And, it's just a whole thing. So it comes with a limitation. Since I'm all by myself, can I offer dual agency? Careful. Trick question. If I'm all by myself, can I be a dual agent between a buyer and a seller? Sure. I can be the only agent representing both buyer and seller, but can I be a designated dual agent? I have no other person to assign to that buyer if I'm a listing agent, or the seller if I'm a buyer agent. So no, can't do that as a sole practitioner because it requires 2 heartbeats, 2 individual brokers. In real estate rentals, you could represent the tenants as well as the owners. In commercial, they could represent either or. And in property management, you could represent them both at the same time. So rentals are another thing in the mix. That property management agreement is another version of an agency agreement. And yeah, I know. Thank you for telling me. I went ahead and took the camera view of myself off of there because it blacked out again and I just didn't want to take up the time. So property management is just another kind of agency agreement that also has to be in writing. Has the same fiduciary responsibilities. We owe these now to who? If you're a property manager, who is the client you're working for that you owe fiduciary to? You got it. The owner. That's right. Hey, that's too big. Put the camera's back on. And then in property management, licensed employees, not an independent contractor, but an employee you're paying a salary to that have a license, they are considered subagents. Because as a property manager, you might need some help, and you might hire a staff to help you with all these, because you're probably managing lots of properties. And then the last bullet, unlicensed employees in property management, that's a whole special thing. If you remember, unlicensed people involved in property management working for a property manager broker can do more things without a license than you can on the sales side. One of those things is they can show the rental properties to prospective renters. They can actually show them as a non-licensed person. In sales, you can't do that. You can't hold an open house by yourself if you don't have a license. You can't sell houses for sale without a license. But in the property management sector, as an employee, W-2 paid employee for a broker boss, you can. You can execute leases as well. But that property management agreement is an agency agreement, just like a listing one. A transactional broker provides a service without representing a party. We don't do that in North Carolina. If you're a broker in North Carolina, you're representing somebody. You can never not represent someone. We talked about this already. First substantial contact, the M&M, money and motivation, is the deadline for the disclosure of first substantial contact. So let me tell you about another possible test question. In the answer choices, they might say, after explaining like a paragraph, they will say, Betty walked into an open house that Phil was doing, and Phil's the listing agent. And so Phil introduced himself by name. And then a few minutes later, Betty told Phil that she qualified for $300,000. And then a few minutes after that, she told him that she really has to buy a house in the next 6 weeks. At what point was Phil required to talk about the working with agents disclosure? And then the answer choices would be when he introduced himself, when she told what she was pre-approved for, or when she told when she had to buy a house by. And there's going to be 4 answer choices, but keeping it simple here. Which one triggers the requirement of first substantial contact to now talk about working with agents? Yeah, it was that pre-approval. It wasn't when he said, "Hi, I'm Phil." "Hi, I'm Phil" is first initial contact, and that is a thing as well. But know the difference between this on the slide, first substantial contact, and first initial contact. First substantial contact is when they start talking about money or motivation. Put on the brakes. Don't let them continue. You need to stop everything and tell them what their options are before they hurt themselves by telling you too much. First initial contact is when you introduce yourself. And you don't have to talk about the working with agents disclosure at first initial contact, because all you're doing is just talking. In fact, at an open house, for instance, you could say, "Hi, I'm Phil," and for an hour talk about the Hornets and the Panthers. At no point have you triggered the need to talk about working with agents brochure or disclosure, because money and motivation of them never came up yet. You might want to speed things up just as a business choice. Let's go ahead and have a purpose here. But I did a couple open houses in the last couple of months, and I found it useful to kind of let them come in. I'll be friendly, and I'm just like, "Hey, how you doing? Well, you go through, do your thing, and if you have questions, let me know." And I would just kind of, "Oh, are you a neighbor?" Because a lot of times it's nosy neighbors. "Oh, no, you're not. You're just driving through." "Oh, great. Have you been looking for a while?" Stuff like that. Open-ended questions. When they're kind of mostly done and they're walking through, I had positioned myself in the kitchen with a sign-in sheet, and I hand wrote it at the top, and I just said, "Thanks for visiting. For our seller's peace of mind, please register your visit. Name, email, phone number. And then I'll reinforce that, and I would just say, by the way, guys, would you mind taking a second to register so I can show my seller that someone showed up today? So I can prove to my seller that I didn't waste my time here today. And it's sort of jokey, and they appreciate it, and they get it, and every one of them signed it. I've seen Facebook forums where people get all uptight, and one person was almost militant about it, and she said, if you're not at the door requiring them to sign that sheet before you let them in the house, you're not serving your seller's safety and security properly. And I'm like, and me and most of the other people chimed in, and we're like, no, we just don't do it that way here, because that seems counterproductive. You're trying to build a relationship, make them comfortable enough to, who knows, maybe even buy the house. So first initial contact is something that's going to happen, but doesn't trigger the need to further disclose anything yet. But any minute they could throw it in there. The better job you're doing of warming them up, the more likely they are to say, oh, by the way, I already got pre-approved for $470. Oh, wait, stop. Before you keep talking, let me give you some insight. There is a point where first initial contact is important for telling them who you represent. And that is if you're talking to a seller or a listing agent, for instance. If you're talking to either one of them, then you need to go ahead and say, hi, I'm Neil. By the way, I'm the buyer's agent. How could this apply in the real world? Maybe you show up for the showing early. You get there before your buyer client, and the seller is rushing around trying to load up the minivan with the kids, and they see that you're there, and you don't want them to think you're just casing the joint. So you get out and you're like, oh, hi, I'm here for the showing. Take your time. I'm early. Don't worry. And by the way, I'm the buyer agent. You don't want them to think that you're just working maybe another broker in the same firm as the one they've listed with. And you don't want to give them a chance to accidentally tell you something that they shouldn't, but you want to acknowledge who you are. And then when you call the listing agent to say, hey, I think I might be presenting an offer. I'm a buyer agent who showed your listing at ABC Street. Again, first initial contact, you're telling them who you represent. So those two things are based on first initial contact, but money and motivation are what this is about, substantial contact. You're just making sure they have full awareness of what their options are. Now, what if it's a phone call that starts this whole thing? They call you by phone. Hey, calling on this sign in the yard. Curious about this house. What can you tell me? How much do they want? Oh, great. That one is $550. It's got 4 bedrooms. Is that what you're looking for? I'd really like 5. Okay, well, that's fair enough. What part of town are you looking for? Is this the main neighborhood part of town, or would you be open to other? Yeah, well, this and that and the other. Oh, okay. And then if you feel that conversation is getting toward money and motivation, you need to go ahead and fit the conversation in by phone. Say, look, guys, before we go much further, I need to protect you. The real estate commission requires that I explain to you how this works. Don't tell me anything you wouldn't want the seller to know. I know you know better, but I'm required to give you that little insight. And so that's what this is about. If you are pre-approved for something, or if you really need to be in a place by a certain time, that's information you probably shouldn't share with me unless you're okay with the seller knowing it. And so this is a phone call. Can you get this signature by phone? You need something with their signature proving that you explained this thing to them. You can't do it over the phone, but what you would do is say, oh, by the way, could I get an email for you? And I'll send you this disclosure information and have you sign off saying that I've explained it to you. So try to get it by email, electronic signing. And then, well, the official rule here is send it to them no later than 3 days. That's left over from when we mailed things a lot. We don't really do that much. We could do all this in a matter of a minute over electronic signing now. But the other point is, when it's first substantial contact over the phone, send it to them immediately, but not later than 3 days for signing. If they won't sign it yourself so you have it for the file, proving that you tried. And then when you do finally meet them in person, before you show that first house, say, oh, by the way, before we go do the fun stuff, remember that conversation on the phone, money, motivation, who I represent? I'm not asking you to hire me yet. You're going to kick my tires, try me out. I think we'll work well together, but I get that you want to try it out first. But I need to go over this with you again. If they haven't signed it yet, great time for them to sign it, but you do need to address it again in person. Don't just gloss over it and say, we talked about it last week and I don't really want to talk about it anymore, so I'm just not going to mention it to them. It specifically requires, the commission requires that we review it again with them when we get face to face. Okay. And we can't ask questions to draw out that information until we've disclosed this stuff to them and given them fair warning. So don't ask them what they're pre-approved for until you've had this disclosure conversation with them. So ideally, we deliver this to them, we explain it to them, and then we determine, hopefully, go ahead and set it up. Say, so you ready to go? Sign right here and I can be your buyer agent. And if they won't, again, we could take it a little slower. Let's see. We've talked about all this. We covered all this. We talked about oral buyer agency. You must discuss it on purpose, intentionally. And the BIC PB relationship, the activities are in the name of the BIC. They only get compensated from their broker in charge. A provisional broker, any broker, can't get paid from any other broker in charge. It's got to flow through their own broker in charge. Our role is as an independent contractor, not an employee, typically. We get paid with a 1099 document, not a W-2 document. That might be very different from what you're used to. Written current real estate license, an employment contract with our firm, with our BIC, and our income is based on commission rather than salary, which means more risk, right? Because if it doesn't close, you're probably not getting paid. But if it does close, you could be getting paid quite a bit. You do have to be responsible. You don't just get that check. Remember the first paycheck you got and you were devastated because you did the math and you said $9.20 an hour times 9 hours is $81 or whatever. And then it was more like $40 because of all those taxes. This isn't happening in this. You're getting that big chunk. They give it to you. You get the whole thing. You could cash it and roll around in the dollar bills if you wanted to, but you better be willing and ready to give that 20, 30% of those dollar bills back in April or every quarter or however you set up your taxes, because you got to pay taxes out of that at some point. And a lot of agents get in trouble with taxes because they feel like they won the lottery and they're like, I'll just go ahead and spend it now and I'll just make another commission and use that for the taxes. And then it builds and builds and builds, and then April comes. And I think a vast majority of agents also file to push their taxes until October. I would bet 99.9% of agents don't file in April. They say, I'll do it in October. Let me file the form that says I'm going to push all this to October. So 3 most important words in real estate, the old joke is location, 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 but for brokers, for realtors, it's disclose, disclose, disclose. We got to tell everything as brokers. And that is 7. And we didn't only cover 7 just now, guys. We got a little bit into 8 as well. So we are on track. We're in good shape. Let me touch on that a little bit. We're not going to launch into anything fancy because it's time to go just about. Let me give you a little bit of insight and prep for next week. Chapter 8, Unit 8. We're going to look at more specific laws, the paperwork, more forms. We're going to look at some forms. So look at the listing agreement, the working with agents agreement, out of the Google Drive, the buyer agency agreement. We're going to talk about the antitrust laws, the Sherman antitrust laws. There's no standard commission. There's not allowed to set up a monopoly. You're also not allowed to get together and say, you know what, we hate this other real estate firm that they're always cutting commissions and undercutting us and beating us out. So we're going to get together and boycott showing their listings. That's not allowed. Or this inspector over here, we don't like what he's doing, so let's boycott and not send any business to that inspector. Also illegal under the antitrust laws. So we'll talk about that. And level 3 stuff is some math, the fun math, the math that you will have no problems with because it's about the money that goes in your pocket. Somehow we learned that math really well. And listing contracts and buyer agency contracts. So look at those forms. Let me know of any questions along the way. Follow-up question here. What happens if they just won't sign the working with agents disclosure? If you, the agent, signs it, can you still represent them? Remember that working with agents disclosure is not the thing that hires you. So signing that doesn't affect whether you can represent them or not. It's just some proof in your file that you explained how the whole thing works. You'll follow up and then say, well, now to hire me, here's the buyer agency agreement or the listing agreement. And that's the thing you need them to sign so that you can do the work for them. So that's an easy thing to confuse. It's very common. So yeah, don't confuse the working with agents disclosure with the actual agency disclosure that hires you. That'll be more clear when we actually see those forms in person together next week. So we're going to cover agency, finish that up next week on wait a minute. We don't have class. We wouldn't have class on Thanksgiving, but I think we do have class on Wednesday. I'll confirm that. Pretty sure. Is everybody planning on that? Do you think otherwise? That's the way we did it last year. If it's any different, I'll let you know, but we're here for Wednesday, but not for Thursday. Next on the list, 8, 9, 10, then 14, 15 in the units, meaning that's finance. So it's going to be agency. We'll finish up. Contracts, that's 9 and 10, and then finance. Those are all the big double cheeseburger, hamburger portion of the sandwich, right? That's the big stuff. So keep reading ahead. Stay on top of this. Don't fall in a hole. Don't fall behind. This is critical. And let me know what I can do to help you. And have a great weekend. Let me know what I can do.